everyone. I'm Ariel Korath. I'm one of the co-leads here at GreenHomeNYC Green Careers Group. I will go into a little bit more about what GreenHomeNYC is all about. I've been volunteering with GreenHomeNYC for a couple of years now, and I work at WSP at the One Penn Plaza, and we actually have Jocelyn Dupre, who's another colleague of mine at WSP, as one of our speakers, so I look forward to bringing in more WSP talent and sprightliness to GreenHomeNYC in future occasions. So I'm just going to begin with a brief introduction on what GreenHomeNYC is all about. And if you could direct your attention either to me talking or the presentation up here. I'll just start off with that brief introduction. We will then segue into the panel discussion on climate policy, which everyone, I'm assuming, is very eager to listen in on. And then we will have opportunity for questions and answers at the end, so please archive those questions, save them for the end. We'll be sure to get to it with the time that we have. And as you know, there is some really delicious food that is available, right? So food makes us happy, right? So keep the appetites full because we'll probably have leftovers at the end, and then there will be a lot of time for networking and getting to know your speakers and your facilitator and us here at GreenHome. Okay, so what is GreenHome all about, right? I'm assuming some people are here through myself, Manasi, Liz, any other connections that you have, but we're a nonprofit organization. We've been around since 2002, and our mission is to promote energy efficient buildings, sustainable buildings, green building methods, along with providing either transitioning and or newcomers to the sustainability field, providing them with the necessary information needed to make something of a career in that field. Okay, so GreenHome consists of 3 different programs, right? So as I stated earlier, I'm a Green Careers lead. So I'll start off with that program to discuss. Really what we do is we're providing those networking initiatives, those networking opportunities to folks like yourselves. About 2 years ago, I was actually someone who was looking to step foot in the field, and luckily now I work at WSP in the dream job that I want, right? So that could be someone like yourselves, for example. We do this through, different initiatives, programmings, networking, like I mentioned, but also we are well known for our resume workshop. So kind of like speed dating, except you're reviewing resumes with people. It provides, newcomers to the field a chance to get your resume reviewed by people who are in the field that you want to be. So it's a very valuable experience for many people. Next, that's okay. The next group I want to briefly talk about is our green buildings tours. We typically feature a tour every quarter, and the idea is to provide people the opportunity to go and view and experience different green buildings, getting to talk with operations facilities, architects, engineers, and learn more about how sustainability is quote unquote realized at these buildings or facilities. And then our last group is actually a group that I used to be a part of. We're known as Monthly Forums Group, and this group features very lively Q&A with speakers like the ones that we have here today, but focus more so on initiatives and policy, New York City climate law, for example, and they really get into the weeds with the stuff that we're all, trying to do at our own workplaces, for example. Next. Cool, so as far as getting involved, I have tested that QR code. It does work. Thank you very much. I appreciate you doing it over here. So yeah, we're always looking for volunteers. Green Careers tends to be our smallest group, although with the help of Manasi and Liz, we are slowly growing, so we really appreciate the extra help. But we're on all social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, what am I forgetting? Instagram, YouTube even, so please follow us, learn a lot more. We're very active on LinkedIn as well, and we would love to learn more about you guys and what you care about, along with having the help if needed. All right, Manasi, you're up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for making it here on a Tuesday evening. We're slowly and surely getting to the speak. I'm Manasi. Like Ariel explained, I'm a volunteer with GreenHomeNYC, and I'm really, really excited to be joined by a super interesting panel today. These guys have a collective of over 40 years of experience in climate policy, and I truly can't wait to dig in and learn about everything that they've been up to. I'm going to start with a quick round of introductions for everyone, and please add on anything that I missed eventually. And this is going to be extremely free-flowing, so whoever feels the need to prompt and answer my questions, feel free to just jump in. This is going to be super informal and super casual. And then, like Aaron explained, we're going to have some space for questions towards the end. We're joined today by Kate Mikuliak. She is a program manager for strategic policy at the New York City Department of Transportation, where she enables the sustainable movement of people, goods, and transport. Kate is the department's policy unit lead on freight, resiliency, and sustainability initiatives, and is currently producing the department's next strategic plan as well. She is also the city lead for Women in Climate, which is another cool organization that you should check out if you identify as a woman and want to work in climate. We're also joined by Jocelyn Dupre, who is the Vice President of the Climate Resilience and Sustainability Practice at WSP USA. She's a multidisciplinary urban planner whose work supports clients across Boston, Long Island City in building up their climate resilience. She was also at the New York City Economic Development Corporation earlier, where she led urban planning and climate resilience for all of New York's 5 boroughs. Joining us also is fellow GreenHomeNYC member Dan Edelman, who is a project lead at Delivery Associates. He leads a team working with the coalition of national nonprofits to help US cities take action at the intersection of climate and racial equity. He's managed policy and programmatic portfolios for a variety of topics like climate and energy, racial justice, workforce development, to name a few. He's also helped lead a think tank that engages with directly impacted communities and brings them into advocacy and policy making. Welcome all of you. First off, please feel free to add on anything that I missed. And for the benefit of this audience, we'd love if you could just talk about how your current work intersects with climate policy, whichever one of you wants to go first. I think I'm seeing Kate.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
My job is to develop and execute sustainable urban policy for the City of New York, specifically New York City DOT, which I'm sure all of you know run the city's subways and buses. You're shaking your head, but it's a trick thing. That's who does that? The MTA. Good. Okay. So just making sure you guys are on me. New York City DOT, I'll just call it DOT from now on, is the agency that works to make it easier for New Yorkers and their stuff to get around. Now, as the agency has the jurisdiction over the 6,000 plus miles of streets and the 780 something bridges that we have in our city, historically that focus has been on getting cars and trucks from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. Now, as we all know, that's unsustainable, right? A focus on cars and trucks is unsustainable. And so luckily, Mayor Bloomberg, almost 20 years ago now, recognized that. He recognized the seriousness of the climate crisis, and he also recognized the role of transportation, specifically in urban environments. In New York City, transportation is the second largest emitter of GHG, right behind buildings. And so starting in about 2007, 2008, under the leadership of then Commissioner Jeanette Sadik-Khan, the city took our focus and for DOT and focused to promoting and enabling the sustainable modes of transportation. So think using the subways and buses and bus lanes and bike lanes and city bike and plazas and really reimagining the streets as places for people and not for cars. And my first 4.5 years at DOT was really involved in making those things happen. So I did strategic engagement, I did government relations, and I did legislative affairs. And all of that work then and now is guided by the city's strategic climate plan. The first iteration of this was in 2008. It was Plan NYC under Mayor Bloomberg. One NYC was the strategic climate plan during the de Blasio administration, and now we just published in April Mayor Adams' Plan NYC Get Sustainability Done. And so my role at DOT is really to help develop, working with folks like Jocelyn at WSP, the content of this plan and the commitments moving forward, in addition to other climate
projects at the agency that come up. So that's kind of like a whole big picture of DOT's work in climate and my own work.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Hi everyone, I'm Dan Edelman. I'm a project leader at a consulting firm called Delivery Associates. Their shtick is focusing on policy implementation, so they work with governments, nonprofits, and philanthropies to really focus on not just kind of creating plans, but making sure they implement on the ground in a way that actually improves lives and outcomes for people. Right now, I am co-leading a project with them that isn't public yet, so I'm going to be like slightly cagey and sorry for that. But we're working with a philanthropy and a few national nonprofits to select 25 cities who are going to be working with us to make the most of kind of this moment where there is unprecedented federal funding for climate and infrastructure in a way that doesn't just move the needle on climate, but also builds wealth in Black communities.
I'm Jocelyn Gray. As mentioned, I currently work at WSP. In my role, I lead our resilience practice for the Northeast and work as a part of our national climate resilience and sustainability team. I service primarily public sector clients, some in the private sector, but even in those cases, often for nonprofits. For example, working right now for the New England Aquarium in Boston. Earlier this year, we had the opportunity to support the city of New York on Plan YC and help with some technical analysis and technical writing to support the city in getting that plan out. I also work on site plans like New England Aquarium, that's trying to figure out their future with climate change and how to better serve the surrounding communities from an equity perspective, how to use their site to help protect the upland communities, and then at the same time, they're a research institution that's dedicated to studying and understanding the impacts of climate change on marine species across the world. And so that impact that they have at their site is just one piece of that larger puzzle, and they want to make sure that their site embodies what that future is. So that project is very near and dear to my heart. But I think in general, what I've been able to do now that I've moved from the public sector, where I was a couple of years ago, to the private sector, is work with so many different clients and understand that everyone's baseline is so different. In New York City, we are just so lucky. I mean, we have the New York City panel on climate change. We have so many resources. We think we're behind, but we're really doing so much. But in my role, yes, I primarily focus on the Northeast, but I'm also able to assist clients across the country from Hawaii to Texas to Florida, and just really learning about all of those different conditions and different baselines, and then take that globally, and it's even a much different conversation. I'll leave it there for now.
Awesome. I think all of these projects sound super interesting, and we could actually just have a whole session, have you presenting each of your work, and that would itself make for such an interesting session. What for me is truly amazing is that all of you have so much collective experience in a space that wasn't really top of mind, even I would say less than a few years ago. So I think what I'm curious to learn, what I'm sure a lot of our audience members are curious to learn, is what did your journey to working in climate policy look like? How did you kind of go about that? Where did you start? How did you end up here? And again, in no particular order, just feel free to kind of jump in and share. Yeah, we're all looking at Dan now.
Oh no, I'd like to go last. I have the most ridiculous journey.
I think, I always wanted to help people with my career. I started out working for a nonprofit for a few years, doing grant writing and marketing. And I think, what I learned in that space was, yes, I could have an impact, but it felt one step removed. And I learned more and more about urban planning, which was something I actually didn't even know what it was or what it meant, honestly, at the time. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that is actually what I was really interested in. It was a million different things, but it all came down to thinking about how we live in space and how to make the places that we live better and serve us better. And it felt very hands-on and tangible and something I could see the outcomes of, even if it takes 10 years. but 20 or 30 sometimes. And so I went to get my master's in urban planning. I started to work for the Department of City Planning as an intern when I was doing my graduate studies on their Resilient Neighborhoods Initiative, which was the post-Sandy initiative to put in, I'm trying to think of how to say this without getting super technical, but to update the zoning in order to allow people to upgrade their homes post-Sandy and not just build back how they were. So for example, on the east shore of Staten Island, you had these really narrow lots and these tiny little homes that had been winterized. They were originally summer homes, and they actually didn't meet modern day building requirements for light and air and human safety. So, they could be built back exactly as they were, according to the codes and the federal funding, but they couldn't be elevated. And so we did studies to understand, okay, what needs to quickly change in the law to allow people to use this money more effectively so they're not just building back their homes the same way they were, but also, ensuring that there is a basic level of safety while allowing flexibility. And that was my first foray really into the resilience space. It was really interesting, but at the same time, the federal government was coming in to build a huge seawall. And Department of City Planning could only control the zoning. And there were all these other things happening, and I was like, I need to be a part of the bigger picture. And so I went to EDC, where I was for 7 years, and got to work on projects that spanned zoning, capital investments, and really thought holistically about either sites or neighborhoods. So I worked on Inwood in Upper Manhattan, where it's over $500 million in investments, many of which DOT is working on the Greenway, and then a few $100 million that will go into waterfront parks, investments in schools, and all of that, thinking about the future with climate change. And I went on then to work on Lower Manhattan coastal resiliency and the Fidei Seaport Master Plan, where we had to rethink an area where you have an elevated FDR Drive, you have multiple waterfront uses, from Whitehall Ferry Terminal to ferries, and the elevated FDR Drive run by the state, and you're like, you have this place with half the city's subways and all of this critical infrastructure, but there is no place to actually put physical protection because there's so much happening. So we had to do a 2.5-year study just to figure out the basics of how we could protect the future of Lower Manhattan. And so that's really what my work has been across my career, of working on these multidisciplinary projects and trying to find climate solutions that really look at things holistically and that also service communities. Oh, EDC, sure. EDC is the city's Economic Development Corporation, so it's a quasi-public, quasi-private agency. They kind of function with their own rules, but they report to the mayor, and are there to service New York City, improve quality of life, and improve neighborhoods and jobs.
I was on a boat tour this past Sunday, and someone from EDC was there, and he explained it as it's like the nonprofit. It's the biggest contractor with the city, and that really helps to understand like the nature of that quasi-government. So the way I got into climate, so I never said like, oh, I want to pursue climate policy, because like climate wasn't a thing 15, 17 years ago, however long. In fact, it was global warming. And climate change was this whole big push from the oil and gas industry to make it less scary. And I love how we have co-opted that and really made it our own, right? Climate means climate action, and not like, oh, it's just climate change, it's no big deal, right? So Dan keeps on saying he has a circuitous route to his job, but I think in many ways, I do as well. So I was a community organizer in college, both on campus and also in my neighborhood, and that meant I was involved in local politics, so I ended up, long story short, working for the council member, not because I was particularly passionate about local policy. In fact, it was the job I took because it was easier for me to go out swing dancing, because that was my passion at the time. And so I kind of was like, let me just phone it in, day job, get a job right out of college. And because I rode a bicycle, they put me in charge of transportation policy. And because I was the crunchiest of the office staff, they put me on environmental, including, recycling and waste management. And through, being assigned to these policy areas, I fell in love. Like, I absolutely really saw the connection between environmental justice specifically and also just like mobility. Like, it is easier for people to get around when they have multiple options, right? So it's about multimodality, and that could be you take a city bike to the subway instead of walking because it's faster. And that trip is so much easier than if you were to drive and have to find parking, et cetera, et cetera. And so also during the time that I was really getting interested in transportation policy, it was the first time the city pushed congestion pricing back in 2007. And that was it still is today, don't get me wrong, but in 2007 it was even more of a controversy. And it was something that the council member I worked for took a stance for it as a Manhattan council member. She was actually in favor of it, and that was something that I really had to randomly answer calls from constituents yelling and screaming at me and really have to stand there and be like, this is good policy. It's good public policy. It's good for the city. And so kind of that was honing my chops to understand and meet New Yorkers where they were in terms of change being scary. And that really helped me when I transitioned to DOT. And of course, I was so inspired by the leadership of Jeanette Sadik-Khan at the time, who was, really a game changer for New York City and what the streets look like. So I went to working on specifically the bus rapid transit program, which is select bus service, which is bus lanes with faster boarding. And if anyone's interested, I can get more into the policies on that. City bike lanes, all of the transportation projects I was involved in, both in a supporting role and also legislatively and getting it through the electeds. And I also feel like we can talk in the Q&A, like Jocelyn talked a lot about like the content and how it's related to climate. So if folks have specific questions about how the projects that DOT work on impact the GHG emissions or make sustainability enhancements, I'm happy to answer them. But for the sake of not rambling, I will stop there.
So I have an educational background in policy, but not climate policy. So this is my circuitous route and kind of how I moved from one policy area into climate policy. I began my career right out of college doing several years of direct service work as a teacher and then in a social services agency. Went to get a master's in policy and took basically the most interesting job I had coming my way out of that master's program, which involved helping set up a large reentry program in Arkansas, where correction officials love having a New York Jew tell them what to do. I did that as part of a nonprofit that sort of provided consulting services, technical assistance to state and local governments, and then took on kind of other projects with a bunch of northeastern cities, including some in transportation. Took a next job working for New York City government on kind of human services innovation stuff. While there, helped design and manage a green workforce program. Took another job that Manasi had mentioned, helping run a kind of startup think tank and leadership development program. We brought in folks who had impressive careers but had not worked in policy previously, and were directly impacted by policy in one way or another, and gave them a platform, support, and training to become policy leaders quickly. My job there was one part running and growing a startup nonprofit, and the other part was teaching other folks how to do policy and advocacy successfully. On the side, though, because it was a think tank, I was able to do research and write and publish and advocate. And there was a little bit of a hole. A lot of people were excited about a civilian climate corps. They were excited about green jobs, but folks in the climate sector didn't have a great understanding of workforce policy, which isn't actually that complicated as far as policy areas go, but there was an opportunity to do some writing and publishing. I leveraged that to get into a couple coalitions where I met some folks from nonprofits and advocacy groups, did some additional consulting with them, including with Rewiring America, a national electrification advocacy group. and then use that to get my current job, where I'm a consultant at kind of the engagement manager, team leader, project manager level. They hired me specifically to run engagement with New York City and the first deputy mayor's office. And then I was kind of able to angle into this project as my second project. Which is all to say, like, working with people, building connections, finding little opportunities to like insert yourself where you can, then expertise becomes, you know, debatable. At this point, like when I'm talking to people, people often identify me as a climate guy. You two would not justifiably, like based on my educational background. But in terms of signaling, like I am that now, for better and worse.
I think what I'm hearing is that all of you set out to do things that were kind of real issues on the ground. We're trying to solve a problem that the neighborhood or a community is really facing, and that just by the nature of the world as it stands today, climate invariably just gets weaved into that conversation, and that kind of, you know, and then your jobs do end up becoming climate policy jobs. Just moving into, I think this has been extremely interesting, and there's obviously a wealth of experience between the three of you, but if each of you were to just like take an example of like an anecdote or an incident, or it could even be a project of what is it for you, what is an incident that for you encapsulates what's it like to work in climate policy, like the frustrating, the great, the, you know, infuriating part of it. Just share an example with us. I think we'd love to kind of get deep into your day-to-day and let's just learn what it's like. So, yeah. Jocelyn, you're smiling.
I'm
going to
thinking
call you
of
out.
different examples, and if I can say any of them.
That's also a problem, for sure.
You know, because there's between, you know, whether things are public with the city and NDAs with clients. Maybe there's a way that I can tell a story without telling you the details of what it's about.
We love that.
So there was a project that I was advocating for a very long time. It was a waterfront investment, not one of the ones I've spoken about today, so maybe you'll be able to find it. You know, I felt like that waterfront investment should be protection for the neighborhood. However, you know, there was that was not in the cards, and so things moved forward for a long time in the planning space to have this just be an open space that would serve the community. But over time, as many other investments were made and equity considerations were elevated, eventually it was realized that coastal protection was needed in this area. And suddenly the opportunity became this capital project that already had money behind it along the waterfront to create waterfront open space. And I would say where it got really messy was then it becomes the implications for everywhere else. Setting policy precedent, making now different investments work together, half of which were already under construction. And that's often the story in many places, right? Cities are like living places. There's always construction, there's always progress. So we can't just halt everything and start with a clean slate and have this perfect future climate city. But I think playing the long game, understanding, yes, it might not happen immediately, but knowing that when there is an opportunity, being able to take advantage of it, to align projects, and to not be scared of, you know, trying to do things even when it's really tricky, and you know that, you know, again, things might be already under construction, it might not all work out perfectly at one moment in time. But over time, you know, we need to adapt, and I think it's going to take multiple different layers and many different strategies.
Not responding to your question, but building on what you just shared slightly. I think generally in a lot of policy jobs in general and climate policy jobs in particular now, folks are trying to strike a balance between an impulse to get stuff done quickly because we are in an urgent moment, and coming up against kind of trying to do processes that are equitable, inclusive, small d democratic, and that they are like actually engaging every stakeholder. And I think that is a challenge that stretches across the field right now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've a million thoughts about that. So I am gonna spill some tea, so please don't tweet about this. And so in 2021, at the end of 2021, the then commissioner of DOT called me into his office, which is weird, and was like, Kate, I want you to put together a capital project proposal to reactivate the waterways for freight in 48 hours. You know, go ahead. And I was like, first of all, we are not the agency that oversees the waterways, EDC is. And, but this particular commissioner had a real interest in trucks and reducing truck traffic, which is really important. But, you know, it shouldn't be done in 48 hours. And a capital project is, you know, a very big thing. And so everyone stopped what they were doing, and I worked with the Economic Development Corporation and the folks at our ferries team and the folks in our freight team and a few other partners to actually get a proposal to the mayor in 2 days, and he greenlit it. And so then I was on the hook for actually fleshing out what this proposal would look like. And there's a huge difference between a one-pager that says, here's what we're gonna do, and like the actual like budget lines and the number of head counts and where those, you know, what civil service titles those people would hold and where they would sit and you know, the expense, the programmatic element to support the capital element. We came up with this plan that was then announced by the mayor about a month later. It was the Blue Highways was the big program announcement, and we had $38 million in the budget. So we had $38 million in the budget, 18 million of which was to go to this project. And the next step was in my court was to release a request for expressions of interest to engage the business community on their interest and their ability to start servicing New York City's freight needs through the waterways. Now, New York City has 520 miles of coastline, which I think there's like a bunch of different stats about how big that is, but it's big, right? There's like the coast to coast, like I don't know the top of my head, so I won't lie. But it's 520 miles of coastline, it's huge. Yet we get 90% of our goods delivered via truck, right? And there's only so many points in which you can enter the city, period. And that's why congestion is so bad. That's why air pollution and traffic and all that stuff is really bad. And so it's a really important issue. But it's not the only thing, because what are boats powered by? Diesel. And often they're dirtier than trucks. And so there's this element of, we were really pushing and gunning for making sure that there were sustainable modes that would then connect to these boats and deliver to what's called the last mile. And so it was, you know, it's a great project. And so anyway, so January 2022, I'm supposed to get this RFEI out ASAP. You know, the commissioner is not wasting any time on this. And then the next week, the commissioner leaves. He's no longer the commissioner. We found out by reading the news, right? That's how I think even he found out. And within a few weeks, not even a few weeks, like within a week, I was no longer managing the project. And within a few months, all of that money had been reallocated. That being said, it was still something that the deputy mayor and other people in the administration really held as like a thing that they're really proud that they're doing. And in fact, that RFEI is being released next week.
Oh my gosh.
Which is really exciting, but how how many years later? And it was funny because to prepare for this conversation, I looked back at some of the work that I did to develop that, and my timeline had the actual program launching this year, and it's just like shed a little tear. But I mean, it's something that is still being worked on, but just like, if something is a political like favorite, it will get pushed very quickly, which is a good thing and a bad thing, right? Kind of what both of you were saying. And if not, it will take years and years and years and years. But it might happen. It probably will happen. So that's my story.
Oh my gosh, it sounds like, I think you said it well, that there's like this sort of push and pull between the urgency of the crisis, but the actual sort of work and the planning and the headcount and the policy implementation of it takes a really, really long time, and for good reason. You are changing a built city which is very live, very thriving, and you're changing it for the communities. Would you say that that aspect of it has changed with the urgency being the way that it is regarding the climate crisis? Are you seeing that the ecosystem itself is evolving, both in terms of how quickly things are happening, and also if you could just, again, this is a careers focused event, so if you could just speak a little bit about the nature of opportunities that maybe now exist that you're seeing that you didn't see a while back when you were getting started, that you may have wanted to see. So two-part question now, but yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
And I think now for the first time there's money, like there's real money to spend. And so that's changed everything. The Inflation Reduction Act and I never remember the exact things, IIJA, infrastructure, and investment and job, thank you.
Bipartisan infrastructure law.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think there has been a will for a really long time in New York specifically. You mentioned under Bloomberg, right? The first Plan YC was put out, and there were many ambitious goals, but I think now is the moment where it's actually about delivering. So like Local Law 97 was put out, right, for all large buildings to reduce their energy consumption very significantly. And over the next, until 2050, I guess, is when everyone has to hit net zero, but I think the initial fines start, 2035 or something like that. And so, I think it's the moment where a lot of these ambitious policies that have been around for a very long time are really being implemented, action is being taken, and there's real money and backing from the federal government. And then you have the New York State Environmental Bond Act investing over $4 billion. And I think, in terms of career opportunities, there's definitely a lot more titles out there that explicitly call out climate versus before, where it was like, okay, this is your job, but we're going to add this onto it. But I still think that there's opportunities in both. The job title doesn't have to have climate in it to be working in that space. I would argue most transportation jobs in New York, you're working in the climate and sustainability space. So yeah, there's just so many different pathways to go with that.
I would expand it further and say all jobs can be a climate job. Like any job can be a climate job. Doesn't have to have climate in the title, because no matter where you're working on, no matter where you work and no matter what you're doing, you're learning about a specific industry, sector, role in the system and its contributions to the climate crisis or its solutions for the climate crisis. And so it's kind of like, as Jocelyn said, it doesn't have to have climate in the title. But to answer your earlier question, I think it does change, the severity of the crisis and in New York City specifically, how seriously the government is taking it, and the federal government as well with Inflation Reduction Act. IRA is Inflation Reduction Act, which is the EPA and Department of Energy is implementing. And then bipartisan infrastructure law is many, many different agencies, but mostly US DOT, and a new Department of Energy, like subsector, I don't remember what the office is called. But yeah, there's just this incredible opportunity right now So there is a lot of funding, but there's also a lot of ways of looking at what the city specifically is doing on just the day-to-day work seen through a climate lens. So one of the initiatives in PlanNYC is called climate budgeting, which is looking at the climate implications of literally everything the city is doing. It's not saying this will get funding and this won't get funding. It's just saying, if it's kind of like an environmental product declaration of our work, right? It's what is the environmental cost of this work. Now, what the city will do with that, we'll find out. But at least, understanding the problem is the first step.
Trying to think about a build on y'all's great answers. What I would say is, yes, every job can be a climate job. In policy, some jobs are definitely more climate jobs than other jobs. In the policy sector generally, I think there is a mismatch between the number of compelling and interesting jobs. There are plenty of jobs that are just compliance of one kind or another, and then there are jobs that have a more strategic or critical thinking or relationship management or any of those aspects. A mismatch between the number of those more interesting jobs and the number of people who want those jobs. And we have some questions coming up with concrete suggestions and stuff like that. But I think there is a certain amount of entrepreneurship and or hustle that is often needed to get your foot in the door in those spaces.
Interesting. That is a great segue actually into my next question. And you alluded to some of these sort of traits that you kind of need to even secure roles that are more strategic in the policy space. But as you do your climate policy jobs, what are the skills? And of course, I'm cognizant that a lot of you are much more senior in your roles, and so the nature of skills may have evolved over time, but what do you kind of go back into your arsenal and use on a day-to-day basis consistently? Yeah.
I love this question, and I think that the skills that I use on a day-to-day basis have remained consistent from day one of my career. Because I think that they're just inherent. Some of them are inherent, and some of them I've had to work on, right? So the number one is curiosity, right? So to really be curious about what you're learning about, be critical, and ask questions. And then on top of that, be really critical thinking and critical reading, especially when you get an email that's so long, you're okay, what's going on here? And really taking the time to understand it and having the focus to do that. And it's harder and harder every day with focus, but it's I think a really key piece of especially climate policy. And then communications, being able to communicate effectively and efficiently, because no one wants to get an email that's this long. And one thing in particular that I've learned about 4 years ago, has anyone heard of BLOT? Bottom line on top?
Bluff, bottom line up front.
Yeah, I've learned it as BLOT, right? And so this idea, instead of saying here's the problem and here's what we've been thinking about doing and we're curious about what you might want to do and we'd love to have a meeting to talk about it more. You start with, we'd love to have a meeting to when are you available? We are setting up a meeting, we're proposing these dates, here's what we're talking about. So yeah, curiosity, critical thinking, and communications just happen to be alliteration. Alliterative, that's the word I want.
Communication.
Yes, it's 3 C's.
I love all three of those and wrote 3 different but slightly overlapping
No pressure
ones.
to come up with your own.
No. Oh no, I have notes. And they don't. It doesn't work that way. One, I think, ability, and to be clear, growth mindset here. If you hear this and you're that isn't me, you can build it. But ability to develop and manage relationships, to being able to use those relationships, use is a harsh verb, being able to use those relationships to kind of problem solve, thinking about how different organizations, different people have to work together when they have different interests, and being able to navigate those interests to get shit done. And 3, in the context of climate policy, I would say a knowledge and understanding of climate policy and politics.
Excellent.
So, I think it's an interesting question to talk about specific skills, because, well, as an urban planner specifically, I think most urban planners at one point or another have a complete identity crisis over what it actually means to be an urban planner and what this career is. And I think that for me, when I first started out, because urban planning feels like this very nebulous thing, I thought, I need all these hard skills. So I was like, let me become an expert in GIS, and let me take these real estate classes and make sure that I understand all these spreadsheets. And, you know, in the GHG space, which I don't work in, all my, you know, a lot of my colleagues are, experts in doing carbon accounting. And so not to discount at all those amazing technical skills, and my colleagues have all of them across the board, you know, and not in one person, but across a large group. I think the most important thing is really tapping into like what you're good at and what you enjoy, and then aligning that with what your career goals are. So for me, when I was working to develop all those technical skills, my mentors and managers were like, you know, you're really not a technical person. And, you know, you can keep trying to do all of this, but like, you're a people person and you're a facilitator. And, you know, I speak 2 other languages, and I always say, you know, my number 1 skill set is translating across disciplines, translating different ideas to bring people together and to get to the bottom line, whether that's in a design workshop and working with architects and designers and engineers and finance experts to actually develop a design that really works in multiple ways, or if it's in a community meeting and hearing from multiple different people and explaining to them the technical constraints versus what they want and how we can bring that all together to make something that's technically feasible and services the community. And so I think that, you know, it really just depends on you. Like, you can be the GIS expert that's there and you're helping to develop all of the maps that are critically important to come up with the climate outcomes. So you can be the urban designer that's helping to sketch out, you know, what things look like, or the person that's doing the carbon accounting. Like, all of those things are very important. I think it really just depends on you and what you're interested in, and there's going to be an opportunity to align that with a specific career. So that's my advice.
Oh, it's super helpful. I'm like duly taking notes, and we're recording this session. So I, as someone who was working in tech earlier, transitioning to working in climate, I had this idea that, oh, I need to know the science. And I need to be the person knowing it, and I think it's been really helpful, but like, it's really helpful to hear that you do need to ultimately ground yourself in what you're good at, and I think that's definitely my biggest takeaway this evening, so thank you for that. I don't want to take on too much time away from the questions, so this is my last question to you guys for now, and if you don't have any questions, I'm going to jump back in. I have so many more to ask. Now, of course, this audience, me, a lot of people in this room, we're all interested in a career in climate policy. That's why we're here. What is your advice on some practical next steps that people can take, whether it be entry points, or what do we do? Like, if someone wanted to wake up and say, hey, I want to work in climate policy, how do they go out and do that make that happen? So yeah, what's your advice to all of us?
Well, I can tell the story of how I got my first job in the space. I was just really following what was happening post-Hurricane Sandy, and I wanted to be involved in it. You know, I was out volunteering in communities and helping to rip up rugs and, you know, help people so that they could get everything out very quickly and remove the mold in their homes so that they could rebuild. And I just, as my career, as I was studying urban planning, I was like, this is this moment. This is where I want to be. I want to be helping people. And so I was following what the city was doing, and I heard about the Resilient Neighborhoods Initiative. And then I went to an event to hear Mary Kimball at the Department of City Planning speak about the initiative. And then I followed up with her and asked her for a job. And
You're gonna have another of those too.
I applied, and I didn't hear back, and I kept calling her. And then it eventually worked out, and I got an internship there and started working in the space. So I think that I guess my advice would be to the things that I said, of like, and it aligned with my experience at the time, right? I was studying urban planning, I was studying design, I was studying zoning. So those were all the skill sets that they needed for that internship, and it was the thing I wanted to be doing at that moment. So I think, if you could think about what you really want to be doing, and then how that aligns with what's actually happening in the world, then there's going to be organizations or companies or things working on that. So how do you find that and align it?
Okay. Pulling a couple of things out of what Jocelyn just shared, I think there is a piece around reading the news. It can be local news, it can be more broadly focused news. For those who are interested in learning more about climate policy from the news, a very non-exhaustive list of some potential things. Vox, which you all may know, more generalist website, they have some helpful explainers, including from several years back, on kind of issues that go like an appropriate level of depth to get you to like conversant with people who like actually know their shit. Grist, heat map, and volts are all good, some of them with more of an energy focus. I'm sure other folks in the room know a bunch of others. If you are particularly interested in city and or state politics and policy, Politico New York has a morning newsletter which is worth skimming. There is also a publication that's a little bit less well known called City and State that has a morning, midday, and evening newsletter, and they automatically subscribe you to all three. The midday one is state level focused. Depending on your interests, you can just do the morning and evening one. Each one is like a 2.5 minute, 3 minute skim. So like a lot of stuff in your inbox doesn't actually take up that much time. If you read those for like 2 weeks, you'll suddenly be very conversant in what's happening in New York City and New York State politics. Think tanks have newsletters. One that is fairly like new person friendly is RMI, formerly the Rocky Mountain Institute, have a lot of like very digestible things that they put out. And then getting at the volunteering piece that Jocelyn said, volunteering is very helpful. One, for signaling, you can put it on your resume, but two, if you are actually volunteering for something in a substantive way. Say I'm working with somebody and they work somewhere where there is a job opening that I'm interested in and I think I could maybe be an okay candidate for. They don't say like, oh, Dan's like nice, I've like talked to him a little bit, but they say, oh, Dan ran that committee for a few months and was like really fucking good at getting shit done. And then like actually suddenly you have like a significant thumb on the scale for your application, and that can be helpful. Sorry for cursing. Places to potentially volunteer. Again, non-exhaustive. There are a lot of places. Here, Green Home, Transportation Alternatives has a lot of people who work in policy. In New York City, there are democratic political clubs which organize either across theme or locally that have a lot of people connected to policy and politics. There are campaigns for candidates focused on climate. Volunteering for those can be a great way to build valuable connections and learn a lot as well.
What an incredible and exhaustive list. That was impressive. I'm impressed. And I've been in a lot of what he said. I've either been on or in or volunteered with or worked on, etc. And I think Dan's recommendations and this panel explicitly or specifically is very focused on the city, right? And many of you might have more global interests or national interests, and so I'm gonna just add quickly to what I was planning on saying, which is just MCJ, My Climate Journey, Work on Climate, and Women and Climate as Slacks. Those are 3 Slack groups. My Climate Journey, Work on Climate, and Women and Climate. Either free or paid Slacks. Really great opportunities for like climate, right? This is very city-based and urban-based. So I'm actually going to put my coach hat on to answer this question. I have a coaching practice for helping people navigate the climate space, either within or into, so that they can have the impact that they dream of. And this is practical advice, but it's definitely not concrete, so, but it's helpful. So my first piece of, my first recommendation is to get specific, because I want to work in climate policy is not actionable. You can't make that happen, right? I mean, you can, but you can't execute it. And you might, and so you ask yourself, like, what do I want to do? And you might say, but I want to do so many things. And you are maybe scared of narrowing it down, but being very specific and clear about what you want and going after it. It doesn't matter if you're interested in electric vehicles and urban agriculture and carbon sequestration. It doesn't matter which one you pick. Just pick one and go for it, right? It's a lot easier to find a job when you're very specific about exactly what you want, because then you know who to talk to and you know who to call 6 times, right? And the only reason, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that it's hard to pick one thing is we think we're worried about picking the wrong thing, right? If we pick the wrong thing, what's gonna happen, right? At the end of the day, the worst thing that could happen is an uncomfortable feeling, right? We would either beat ourselves up about making the wrong choice, etc., right? So as long as you decide, no matter what happens, I'm gonna be kind to myself, I'm not gonna beat myself up, you can pick exactly what you want. And when you have an idea of what you want, ask yourself why, and do you like your reasons, right? Those are a good pair of questions for literally any decision in your life. Why do you like your reasons? And if your brain gives you, I don't know, as your first response, don't listen, right? Your brain is going to want to keep you in homeostasis. That is the safe place, no change, right? Stay in the cave, be safe. Don't put a lot of extra effort. You know, you're alive now. Any other changes might put you at risk of not being alive. Like that's our like limbic system influencing us. And that's totally human, right? And we don't have to listen to it. So I don't know is gonna be your first response. Just be like, but what if I didn't know, right? Because you do know, right? And often when I'm coaching someone, I'm like, well, what do you want? And they're like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, well, what do you want? And they're like, I know exactly what I want. But they're not letting themselves tell themselves that. So really listen to yourself.
All right, on that note, let's definitely open it up to the audience. What questions do we have?
Yeah, I have a question. So, all right, this could be like totally weird because you guys all might give a different answer, or you might say like, it depends on the project. But I'm just trying to, understand like, if for any of you guys that are implementing some large-scale project, right, in the climate or improving the climate space, let's say theoretically you had a magic wand and you could speed up any part of the process that is likely to be the most annoying or take the most time and be a delay in getting the project done, which one would that be? And feel free to answer it. Each one, I don't know who to direct it to, but maybe like, yeah, I'm just curious.
Procurement,
Yeah.
contracting,
Yep.
that's it.
Finding good contractors?
No, like
No.
the actual process of procurement.
Got it.
Oh, and this is from a city government perspective.
City government.
State or federal
State.
applies to.
Okay.
I feel comfortable folks representing that viewpoint might say the same thing.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, it can take like 16 months. One of my backup stories was going to be about pursuing something faster through like kind of trying to navigate procurement laws, and it ended up taking like 5 years, and it's probably not going to like it's yeah, it's bad. So yeah, procurement.
Got it.
Justin, do you have thoughts?
Well, I work for EDC, that's why we're quasi-city, quasi-public agencies, so we didn't really have that issue as much, although sometimes. but much, much faster. I think that on almost every project that I've ever worked on, the largest holdups were in politics and decision making. And I think that, you know, in New York City, for example, if you want to get something done at the neighborhood level, it's usually decided by the local council member. And so, you know, when we're talking about climate policy on a larger scale, and you're thinking about something like local law 97, that's one thing. But when you're actually trying to rezone and implement, let's say, you know, like the Cornell Tech net zero campus, right, which has so many different opportunities for climate, or Governor's Island, right? There is such intense local politics that it really slows things down very significantly, and that's what I personally would speed up.
The one thing I would add also, this is not responding to your question, but answering an important question that is connected to it. The most important thing when it comes to implementation that doesn't happen, I think, is that the money gets allocated or the law gets passed, and then the attention from leadership in whatever government you're in and the capacity of staff that were devoted to it gets diverted elsewhere and doesn't actually focus on implementation.
The story I told.
Yep.
Wow.
I think we have another question. Go for it.
Hi, this is more of a question for Jocelyn, but obviously everybody can answer. So in my job, I work a lot with building ordinance, like local ordinance for building performance, and energy efficiency. So I'm glad you brought up local law 97. I'm just really wondering, like, what is driving those policy making in the city, county, and state level?
What is driving the policy making? I mean, I think that broadly, right, from the governor and then now in the city level, there are net zero goals, right, for the state and for the city. And our largest sources of emissions are buildings. And so, you know, because of that, if we're going to seriously hit these net zero goals, we can't hit them by just generating new energy. The math just doesn't work out. We can put solar and wind and every type of renewable energy, geothermal, offshore wind, everywhere. From upstate, you know, we're bringing hydropower down from Canada. But even with all of that new generation, the number one way that you can reduce emissions from buildings is through energy efficiency. And that's a big part of what's driving local law 97. You know, I've worked on buildings where you go in and like, oh, we want to do solar panels, and there's an assessment, and they're like, no, solar is going to be like, you know, just a drop in the bucket. But if you have a serious program to reduce the emissions in that building, you can often get it so low that then suddenly, yeah, putting solar panels actually can have, and plus battery storage, ideally, if you can get around the New York City Fire Department, then, you know, you can actually have close to a net zero building. So I think it's, you know, there are some policies that come out that are not driven by data. I think this is a policy that is highly driven by data. And, you know, I think there's a lot of talk about pushback, and there certainly will be, because the fines, you know, it's an equity issue, you know, and I think all the big real estate developers and people complaining about the fines, if you look at how much they make in their buildings, they're a drop in the bucket, frankly. So it's like a joke, even though they throw out these huge numbers. Like, if you compare it, it means nothing. But for smaller buildings, for co-ops, for individual homeowners, it's, you know, individual homeowners, I mean, that's not local law 97, but long-term, you know, it's much harder. For small, you know, family-owned buildings that, you know, they might be big enough to be, you know, triggered by local law 97. That doesn't mean that they have the resources.
I'll just quickly add, we've talked about bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are huge, huge influences because of the money being made available, as well as the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act at the New York State level.
So I have a little descriptive question. So So my name is Rishabh, and my question is tied up to my own experience. So I recently graduated from Columbia with a degree in climate change and international politics. But prior to that, I worked for about 8 years in business and climate. So whenever I'm applying to any job, for example, if I'm applying to a climate policy advisory role with Carbon 180, or I'm applying to a climate action manager role, I see that most of the job descriptions do not really credit a lot of corporate or project management experience as opposed to having pure experience of say 8 years or 6 years in climate. Now my question is that when you, like my interest is pretty much evident with all the volunteering that I do and the 2 years of climate job that I've done, that I want to work in this. But they need a 6 year experience, for example. So that kind of blocks me from even being noticed by the recruiters because possibly they're taking me off the list. So how do I even break into, how do I put my foot through the door and even work in climate policy or any kind of climate job for that matter?
Any advice for transitioning professionals?
Because I also feel like you were saying that the climate sector is also not very new. So when I see a 10 years or 15 years, I'm like, who is going to have 10 years or 15 years of work experience in climate?
Well, I was going to say it's all kind of BS. I mean, all those job descriptions.
Yes, mic drop, let's stop now.
Yeah, I mean, my advice is just apply anyway and really, like, define experience, right? Like, I was a Captain Planeteer and watcher of Bill Nye the Science Guy, like, I could say that I've had climate experience since I was a kid, right? Like, you get to tell the narrative about what your climate experience is. And that might really endear you to a recruiter, right? Like your unique story. Because at the end of the day, it's about, can you do the job? Will you do the job? And do they like you, right? Those are the three kind of big areas that people are looking for. They are not going to be like, but that's 7.5 years. Like it's not like that. And just apply, and then also, kind of take the advice that was given earlier about networking and managing connections and volunteering and just go for it. Don't let anything like that discourage you. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think the question's also interesting in this year. It's been an interesting job market as well. There's a lot of people, especially with the tech layoffs and everything, and then there's a lot of people out there in the market. And so I think that what ends up happening is you kind of get lost in the noise. When you see an opening, it's like 600 applicants. There's no way a physical person is going through that. So it becomes harder to be noticed. So I think your advice about volunteering or building personal connections, or even just being really specific about what you want and then following up 6 times, for example, I think that's the kind of stuff that needs to happen. But if you have any other programs or advice or any other ways that people could make that transition easier for them, I know we spoke about it a bunch, but if you all would add anything to that, then that'd be helpful.
Yeah. Pulling out one micro point that I think both of you touched on. When it comes to years of experience, don't get stuck on that. If you think you can make an argument that you could do the job potentially with a small learning curve. They will say 10 or 15 or whatever number of years to indicate that it's a senior level job. If you have a significant amount of experience doing something else with potentially soft, potentially hard skills that might carry over, project management, people management, anything, it's probably worth applying for.
Is that the best or effective or efficient way to kind of apply it? Given that there are 600, one of the jobs that I was looking at is 1,200 applicants on LinkedIn. I did not even think of applying because I know there's no way. I mean, the chances of me getting selected for a job like that, especially when there are people with climate degrees or urban planning, especially because
But you have a climate degree.
I have a climate degree, but people want maybe urban planners, like urban resilience. I'm interested in cities, but I'm not getting any calls.
I'm
for
hearing
cities.
a lot of you talking yourself out of applying for a job. I mean, that's just you just do it, and don't yeah. I mean, I think you're saying, how do I do it? You just do it. You just hit apply. And then you work your connections, you volunteer, you do all of the other things. And we can talk offline because I know it's hard. I know it's hard,
I've applied to 600 jobs.
Oh my God.
I mean, you know, when I was doing the work for Department of City Planning, it was an internship, and I was older. I had 4 years of professional work experience out of college. I was getting my master's, and it was an unpaid internship. And I know that's not necessarily an option for everyone, but, you know, I did that for just a few months, and then got a job being paid in the space. So it is a hard space to break into. I think that's, you know, there are different paths to get there. Sorry, I didn't want to, I think there was a hand back there.
Yeah. Please speak up. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, just to answer to him is, I think he just needs to believe in himself, you know, and he has much more than me on the climate aspect. And yeah, just don't be afraid, just do it. And I think you should include also your soft skills, if you do have, I believe you do, and just go.
Though I would say it sounds like you're believing yourself. It sounds like you're hitting submit, right? You just shared that you've applied to 600 jobs. So what we covered, you've gone there. And so what I would say is, you know, if you're doing that effort, if you're making the effort and you're not getting the return, you know, I think if I were in your shoes, I would hire a professional, like an advisor, to be like, look at what you're submitting and be like, this is what's not working. This would, you know, and like there are, you know, people. GreenHomeNYC did a career like resume. Yeah, like just you know, keep at it.
I'll try to find out who's the recruiter or the recruiting manager.
Are you guys recruiting?
This turns into all of us giving Rishabh career advice session. I just want to check in and see if there's any questions.
Use AI when you write your resume. I've been told that by a recruiter. Use AI, use the program.
Oh, yeah.
Because you sift through the computer programs that find you to pick you out if you use AI.
Do we have another question?
Sure.
Jimmy.
Yeah, my name is Jimmy. First of all, thank you to all the volunteers. We really appreciate you. And thank you to everyone on the panel. It's really, really insightful. So a piece of advice about getting more and more specific. Thank you for that. And I found out a point in my career where I took a shift into the industry that I wanted to get into, but now I'm kind of like maxed out my current organization, and like I can't go any further there. There was only one job, so there's just not very far to go. So I'm like happy there, but I'm looking for something like more advanced within my specific industry within sustainability. And to be frank, there were a bunch of policies that were like recently released that I thought would like make all these jobs, and make it actually less jobs and less funding. So I'm kind of at a point where I'm like very concerned about staying in this specific track and looking to maybe pivot into like another, like within sustainability, one of like the other kind of subsectors. So are there any kind of policy changes or like fields that you feel like people should be aware of as like, oh, I think a lot of jobs are about to open up there, or I think that that's like a good place for people to be looking right now?
Could you share just 2 words, like what is your current specific specialization with?
Sure, yeah. I currently work in waste.
Okay.
I totally agree with everything you said before, Kate, and there's something to be said for doing a little bit of market research before you decide, like, I want to go into that area. In the private sector right now, a lot of clean tech, clean energy industries are like actually hitting a kind of what a year ago would have been an unexpected rough patch. And so bright spots are like a little limited right now, although you all might have more informed takes. You can look at like projections for kind of what's expected and like kind of out years, a couple years, 5 years, 10 years. You know, solar seems like a sure thing in the medium to long term. But would love to hear y'all's perspectives on that.
I mean,
Where are the next climate jobs going to be? Tell us.
I mean, GHG accounting, I mean, everyone needs to get there. Every private company, public sector, everything. I mean, that's the future. You need to measure where you are today and then develop strategies to how to reduce in the future. So,
Like ESG?
Sorry?
ESG?
So ESG is more, yeah, like if it's the a private company focus, but I would say that there's opportunities across public and private. So on the private side, it would fall within ESG typically. And then on the public side, I mean, it could fall anywhere. It could fall in a department of transportation. It could fall within a buildings department, within any asset management department, like DCAS for the city of New York. They have to manage all the city's buildings. The New York City, yeah, the New York City Economic Development Corporation. So in all of those different agencies, they all need to now measure and then develop future strategies. And the measuring is just starting. So like the number one skill is like being able to manage all those spreadsheets. And if you're interested in that, it's definitely actually a very high demand skill set, both on the private consulting side, I think, and in the public side.
Yeah, I think like life cycle accounting and GHG accounting specifically is coming up in a huge way. I know SEPA has a huge focus, and the classes would get oversubscribed. Really quickly as soon as they came out. But I think there's a lot of private universities that run courses that you can do to just build that specific skill set, which are just online courses. But yeah, this is the interesting thing. This is such an evolving space that it's better to maybe focus on a skill that lends itself across different aspects of climate rather than just necessarily focus on a topic area.
One more question. For you,
can I just prioritize someone else? Sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
Kind of went over this with skills, but I guess I'm kind of curious too, what your actual day looks like, activities-wise, in terms of communicating with stakeholders or focusing on planning. What do you tend to what kind of things do you tend to do?
Today I was in a 3-hour workshop for the New England Aquarium project, working with architects, designers, multiple different types of engineers, marine engineers, structural engineers, permitting specialists, all thinking about, okay, now we've done the existing conditions, we've understood all the constraints, we've understood our design flood elevations for the future, right? So right now the site is at a certain elevation, but what do we want to raise it up to protect against future storms and sea level rise? And now, how do we match the architecture and landscape architecture and the ambitions for what this place is going to be, and these beautiful drawings with all of the actual engineering and technical constraints. So those are some of my days on projects that I work on that are more design focused. When I was working on PlanNYC earlier this year, my days were filled with 1 million calls to help navigate a very complex project management process to help support the city in developing and releasing the climate plan under a very tight timeline. So that was a ton of stakeholder engagement and coordination. When I was with the city of New York, my days would be a mix of those design workshops, that type of stakeholder coordination, but then in the evening going to a public meeting, speaking to community members, kind of generally. And then of course there's all the boring paperwork and budget stuff.
We do have 5 minutes left, so we can continue to answer this question for you, and then after we can give someone who hasn't asked a question yet. Do you still have a question? Yeah. Okay, and then Peter will address your question afterwards, okay?
Emails, Teams meetings, virtual meetings. A lot of, I've had meetings to plan for the pre-meetings to meetings. It can be really bad sometimes, but I think that a lot of things are very delicate, and so sometimes it makes sense. And also, it really depends on what your role is. There could be a lot of external facing, talking to members of the public, talking to stakeholders. My job currently is mostly internal facing to the city and to the mayor's office, but through the strategic plan that I'm producing for the agency right now, we are engaging with stakeholders externally to the agency and also hopefully the public, which is not something I'll get to talk about tonight. But I'm curious, and maybe we can talk about this after, because we are running out of time, but like, why do you ask? Because then I think I might be able to better answer your question. But we can talk about that later.
The one thing I would add to what they said is just, depending on the nature of your role, I'm managing a team of 8 right now, and a lot of my time goes to thinking about internal people management, their professional development, how they're being challenged, what they're working on, ensuring lines of communication are kind of open among us internally so that folks enjoy being on the team.
Thank you. I think Dan has mentioned about one of the most important skill sets is to navigate the stakeholders' various interests to solve the problem. I wonder what is the most challenging thing you have encountered during this process, and do you have any suggestions?
The most challenging thing that you've encountered in stakeholder management. That's a
Challenging in what way?
Anyway, maybe like
maybe the political process is what I heard.
I mean, in Lower Manhattan with the Finite Seaport Master Plan, I know Jacqueline's nodding her head, she worked with me on it. You know, people did not want us to build out into the water, right? There's this issue with climate change where you're working on resilience or adaptation can sometimes feel at odds with our sustainability goals. And the idea of building out in the water, which can disrupt fish species, which takes a ton of fill and materials and all of these things, was really problematic for a lot of people. And I think we approached it by educating and bringing all the technical information to the stakeholders in just an incredibly transparent way to say, like, we understand that, but living in New York City is one of the most sustainable ways to live. And in Lower Manhattan, we have 3/4 of the city's subway lines running through this area. We have the busiest passenger ferry terminal in the country, a Whitehall Ferry Terminal managed by DOT. So, you know, I think that there's always trade-offs when working in this space, and helping people to truly navigate those trade-offs with education and information really helps to ground the conversations and get to a shared understanding of where to move forward in the future.
What I was going to say, what immediately occurred to me is sometimes the people who have the power, it might be an elected official, it might be the leader of your department or agency, it might be the funder, will move the goalposts on a plan that was set, or they will throw out a plan, or they will do something that feels extremely disruptive to what kind of all the stakeholders have previously developed and agreed upon in a really long collaborative process, and it feels really shitty. You need to figure out how to say yes while still preserving some ability to move in the direction that was originally planned for. And you need to have accumulated capital so that occasionally you can say a no, and here's why.
Okay.
30 seconds to just say the challenges are numerous, but the way you overcome them is really leading with what's in it for them, but not from a personal perspective, but speaking from their like role within a community, right? Because if you say, oh, what's in it for me? I'm a car owner and I'm about to lose my parking spot. It's like, it's not about you, it's about your place in a city that is trying to move 8.5 million people, and we can't move 8.5 million people and 8.5 million cars.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Round of applause.